May 26, 1941, 20:47 hours. The North Atlantic, 690 miles west of Brest. 15 aircraft take off from the deck of HMS Ark Royal into a Force 8 gale. Wings open, cloud base at 600 feet. Sea spray freezing to their struts before they've even cleared the flight deck. They are biplanes. Wood and metal frames wrapped in fabric. Top speed 139 miles per hour. A design so far behind the times that Fleet Air Arm pilots called it the string bag. Because, like a housewife's string shopping bag, it seemed capable of holding anything except modern relevance. Their target is the German battleship Bismarck, 50,300 tons at full load, the most powerful warship afloat. Armed with 8 15-inch guns and 4 twin turrets and dozens of anti-aircraft weapons capable of putting a wall of steel into the sky at ranges, these aircraft would need almost a full minute to cross. Bismarck has already sunk HMS Hood in 3 minutes flat, killing 1,415 men and leaving 3 survivors. She is roughly 24 hours from the safety of occupied France and the protective umbrella of the Luftwaffe. If she reaches Brest, the Royal Navy loses her, and Germany proves that a single modern capital ship can outrun and outfight the largest battle fleet in the world. The aircraft closing on her at barely 90 miles an hour in the attack, slower than her own anti-aircraft guns were ever designed to track, should not be able to touch her. In the next 20 minutes, they cripple her so completely she can no longer steer. This is how a biplane the Royal Navy had already scheduled for retirement brought down Hitler's newest battleship. The strategic stakes had been building for 8 days. Bismarck and the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen had slipped out of Gotenhafen on May 18, 1941, under Operation Rheinbung. Admiral Enter L. Jens planned to break into the North Atlantic and savage Britain's convoy lanes the way the pocket battleships and U-boats never quite could alone. The 2 ships were spotted refueling in a Norwegian fjord near Bergen on May 21 by a lone photo reconnaissance Spitfire, its pilot, Flying Officer Michael Suckling, bringing back the images that confirmed the Admiralty's worst fear. The home fleet, under Admiral Sir John Tovey, put to sea from Scapa Flow. 2 heavy cruisers, Norfolk and Suffolk, picked up Bismarck's radar signature in the Denmark Strait on the night of May 23 and shadowed her through fog and ice, feeding a continuous stream of position reports back to the fleet. At 0537 on May 24, the battlecruiser HMS Hood and the new battleship Prince of Wales intercepted. Within 3 minutes of Hood opening fire, a German shell, likely from Bismarck, penetrated her thin deck armor and detonated a magazine. She broke in half and sank in under 3 minutes. Prince of Wales, so knew she still had civilian technicians aboard fixing gun turret faults, pressed the action alone, scored 3 hits on Bismarck, including one that punctured a fuel tank and contaminated another with seawater, and then broke off under sustained fire of her own. Bismarck was damaged, but far from dead. She was down roughly 2 feet by the bow, trailing an oil slick that Royal Navy shadowing aircraft would follow for 2 days, and leaking fuel she could not fully replace. L. Jens made the only decision his orders and his damage report allowed him: detach Prinz Eugen to continue commerce raiding alone, and take Bismarck to the nearest friendly drydock, at St. Nazaire, for repairs. Every available British warship converged on the North Atlantic. The entire home fleet turned to intercept, along with Force H, sailing north from Gibraltar under Vice Admiral Sir James Somerville, built around the battlecruiser Renown, the cruiser Sheffield, and the carrier Ark Royal. But on the afternoon of May 25, Bismarck executed a sharp turn through her own shadowing screen and vanished. Suffolk and Norfolk lost radar contact at roughly 0300 and did not regain it. For more than 30 hours, the Admiralty had no idea where the most dangerous ship in the world actually was, or which direction she was running. Ironically, Elgens himself did not realize he had shaken his pursuers, and a lengthy radio transmission he sent to Naval Group West, reporting on the Denmark Strait action, was intercepted and direction found by British listening stations, giving Tovey a rough bearing that suggested France rather than a return to Germany. It was still a guess. Across hundreds of miles of open ocean, she was found again only by chance, spotted by a consolidated Catalina flying boat at 1030 on May 26, roughly 700 miles from Brest and closing on the French coast at a steady 20 knots. The Catalina's pilot that day, Ensign Leonard B. Smith, was an American naval aviator flying with an RAF crew under pilot officer Dennis Briggs. The United States, still officially neutral. The math facing the Admiralty was brutal. The heavy units of the home fleet, King George V and Rodney, were still too far away and too slow to catch Bismarck before she reached the range of Luftwaffe air cover from French airfields. Only one force stood close enough to strike before nightfall, Force H. And Force H's only offensive weapon at that range was 15 obsolete biplanes armed with torpedoes. Naval planners in 1941 did not expect the Swordfish to matter against a target like Bismarck, and by every specification on paper, they were right to doubt it. The aircraft had entered squadron service in 1936 as a torpedo bomber, reconnaissance, and spotter type. And even before war broke out 3 years later, the Air Ministry was already moving toward its intended replacement, the Fairey Albacore. Itself destined to be retired before the Swordfish, it was meant to replace a biplane with an open cockpit, fixed undercarriage, and a single 690 horsepower Bristol Pegasus radial engine. The Swordfish carried a crew of 3: pilot, an observer who doubled as navigator and bomb aimer, and a gunner manning a single rear-facing machine gun, and it cruised at barely over 100 miles an hour, roughly a third the speed of the monoplane fighters and bombers already dominating European skies. Bismarck's anti-aircraft battery was formidable on paper. 16 105mm heavy dual-purpose guns, backed by 16 37mm and a battery of 20mm automatic cannon, all tied into a fire control system built to engage fast monoplane bombers approaching at 250 miles an hour or more, against a target moving at barely a third of that speed. The German gunnery computers, designed to predict a target's future position from its current speed, heading, and rate of closure, produced firing solutions that consistently threw shells ahead of aircraft that simply weren't covering the ground the computer assumed they would. Gunners watching Swordfish crawl through the flak later described the strange sensation of tracking a target that seemed to be standing still. The weather made the problem worse for the defenders. Low cloud and driving rain forced the Swordfish down to just a few hundred feet for their approach. Beneath the effective engagement envelope of Bismarck's heaviest 105mm guns, which needed altitude, time, and a stable platform to solve a firing problem properly, none of which a pitching battleship in a Force 7C could reliably offer. The very qualities that made the Swordfish look obsolete on a specification sheet, its low speed, its low operating ceiling, its lack of any modern refinement, were precisely the qualities that made it almost impossible for a 1941 battleship's fire control to solve. The aircraft's other advantage was its payload and the men trained to deliver it. Each Swordfish carried a single Mark 12 torpedo, 18 inches in diameter and 1,610 pounds, slung beneath the fuselage on a crutch designed specifically for a low, slow, stable release. The aircraft, flying straight and level at around 90 miles an hour, and roughly 50 feet above the water in the final seconds of the run, well within range of every gun the target carried. It demanded steady nerve from the pilot and split-second timing from the observer, calculating the drop point against the target's speed and angle. Navigation to the target in the first place was equally demanding. With no visual horizon in thick cloud and no satellite positioning of any kind, observers worked entirely by dead reckoning, plotting course, speed, wind drift, and elapsed time by hand on a chart balanced on their knees in an open cockpit at 100 miles an hour. Some aircraft in the strike wave carried an early ASVV, air-to-surface vessel, radar set, primitive by later standards, but capable of reacquiring a large ship-sized contact through cloud once visual contact was lost. A genuine technological edge layered onto an airframe that otherwise belonged to an earlier decade of naval aviation. This was not brute technological superiority. It was a slow, fabric-covered, seemingly antique aircraft made lethal by trained crews executing an exceptionally demanding attack profile in conditions that grounded faster, more sophisticated, more modern aircraft entirely. If you're finding this deep dive into WW2 history trench interesting, subscribing takes a second and supports the channel. The first strike, launched from Ark Royal at 1450 on May 26, came within moments of ending in catastrophe rather than triumph. Flying through thick cloud with almost no visual reference, the 14 Swordfish of the strike wave used radar to locate a large ship-sized contact, dropped below the cloud base at roughly 6,000 feet, and pressed home an attack. It was not Bismarck. It was the British cruiser HMS Sheffield, detached earlier that day specifically to shadow the German battleship at a safe distance, and never informed that a torpedo strike was inbound and might mistake her for the enemy. 11 torpedoes were fired at a Royal Navy cruiser by Royal Navy aircraft. Sheffield's captain, Charles Larcom, alerted by lookouts who could scarcely believe what they were watching, ordered hard evasive turns, and through violent maneuvering and no small amount of luck, every torpedo either missed outright or was successfully dodged. No cruiser was hit, and remarkably, several of the returning aircrews did not even realize their mistake until they landed back on Ark Royal and were debriefed, at which point the scale of the near disaster became clear. The failure exposed a second, more serious problem. A number of the torpedoes had detonated prematurely on contact with the water or the cruiser's wake, a known flaw in the magnetic duplex pistols fitted to trigger the warhead beneath the ship's hull by sensing its magnetic field, a mechanism that worked unreliably in the churned, storm-tossed seas of the North Atlantic. If the second strike went in with the same fuses, against the same conditions, it risked the same failure against the one target that actually mattered. Ark Royal's armorers spent the following hours on a heaving, spray-swept flight deck, stripping every remaining torpedo down and refitting them with simple contact pistols instead. Exchanges made under time pressure in a gale, by men who understood that the single decision would likely determine whether Bismarck reached Brest or not. The second strike launched at 1910. 15 Swordfish drawn from 810, 818, and 820 naval air squadrons, now carrying contact-fused torpedoes, climbed into cloud at around 6,000 feet before descending through it in pairs to search for the real target, with Sheffield now used correctly, only to shadow Bismarck at a distance and vector the strike wave onto her true position, while staying well clear herself. Bismarck's anti-aircraft crews opened fire the instant the first aircraft broke through the cloud base at roughly 2047, throwing up a curtain of 105 mm, 37 mm, and 20 mm fire that turned the gray evening sky into a wall of tracer and shell bursts. The Swordfish flew into it anyway, coming in low, at barely 90 miles an hour, some so close to the water that their propellers threw up spray from the wave crests beneath them. Torpedo after torpedo ran in from multiple angles, a deliberate anvil attack designed to make evasion impossible no matter which way the target turned. Bismarck's captain, Ernst Lindemann, worked the helm hard, turning to comb the tracks of incoming torpedoes and present the smallest possible target, a tactic that had worked against every previous attack that day. Most of the torpedoes missed. Two did not. The first struck amidships on the port side and did comparatively limited structural damage, largely absorbed by Bismarck's belt armor and torpedo bulges, exactly as her designers had intended when they built her, to survive precisely this kind of hit. The second, fired by a Swordfish of 818 Squadron with Sub-Lieutenant John Moffat at the controls, ran in from the port quarter and struck aft, close to the stern. In a section of the hull her designers had never expected to face a torpedo at all. That single hit ended the chase. The explosion tore into Bismarck's steering compartment, jamming her twin rudders at approximately 12 degrees to port and flooding the space faster than damage control parties could pump it clear. German engineers considered every option available to them. Divers were sent below in heavy, freezing seas to attempt to reach the jammed gear by hand and free it manually, and could not get near it through the flooding and the wreckage. A proposal to use explosive charges to blow the damaged rudders off entirely and steer the ship on her propellers alone was seriously discussed, and ultimately rejected as too dangerous to the surrounding hull structure, given how close the charges would need to be placed to already strained plating. Bismarck could still make roughly 20 knots on her engines. She could no longer choose where those 20 knots took her. Locked into a slow, uncontrollable turn to port, the most powerful battleship in the world began steaming in a wide circle, back toward the very fleet she had spent 2 days successfully outrunning. Effectively delivering herself into range of guns, she had every reason to believe she'd already escaped. Through the night of May 26th into the early hours of the 27th, a flotilla of British destroyers, Cossack, Maori, Sikh, Zulu, and the Polish crude Piran, closed in and harried the crippled battleship with repeated torpedo attacks in heavy, confused seas. None of the attacks scored a hit in the darkness and confusion, but that was almost beside the point. They denied Bismarck's exhausted crew any rest, and kept her gun crews at action stations through a long, freezing night, waiting for a dawn that would bring the rest of the home fleet down on them. At 0847 on May 27th, the battleships King George V and Rodney opened fire at close range on a ship that could barely maneuver to present her own broadside. In reply, her fire control degraded, her crew fatigued, her steering gone. Within roughly an hour of sustained, close-range bombardment, Bismarck's main armament had been silenced turret by turret, her superstructure reduced to twisted wreckage, and her hull left burning and drifting, kept afloat, seemingly by little more than stubbornness, since her own crew had by then opened her seacocks to scuttle her rather than let her be boarded. The heavy cruiser HMS Dorsetshire closed in to finish the job with torpedoes at point-blank range. Bismarck finally rolled over and sank at 1,039. Of a crew of over 2,200 men, roughly 114 were pulled alive from the freezing water before a genuine U-boat contact report forced the rescue ships to break off and abandon the search, leaving hundreds more men in the water to die of cold in the minutes and hours that followed. A German weather ship and a U-boat later recovered a handful of additional survivors, bringing the final total to something just short of 120. The ship that had destroyed Hood in 3 minutes flat had been immobilized and ultimately doomed by a single torpedo dropped from a fabric-covered biplane. The Air Ministry had already begun quietly phasing out of front-line service. The Bismarck strike was not the Swordfish's first proof of concept, and it would not stand alone as the type signature achievement, even within its own service record. 6 months earlier, on the night of November 11th into the 12th, 1940, 21 Swordfish, launched from HMS Illustrious under the overall direction of Rear Admiral Lumley Lister, attacked the main Italian battle fleet at anchor in the shallow harbor of Taranto, flying in 2 waves against a heavily defended anchorage bristling with anti-aircraft guns, searchlights, and barrage balloons. The first wave of 12 aircraft, led by Lieutenant Commander Kenneth Williamson, went in first. The second wave of 9 followed roughly an hour later. In under 2 hours of total action, they crippled 3 Italian battleships for the loss of only 2 aircraft and 2 aircrew killed. The battleship Comte de Cavour was struck below the waterline and settled onto the harbor bottom, effectively out of the war for good. Littorio, one of Italy's newest and most powerful battleships, took 3 torpedo hits and was put out of action for months. Caio Duilio was hit and beached to avoid sinking outright. In a single night, half of Italy's operational battle fleet had been neutralized by aircraft that most naval staffs on either side would have described, in 1940, as hopelessly outdated. It was the first time in the history of naval warfare that carrier-launched aircraft had decisively defeated a fleet at anchor, and it was studied intensely by naval planners around the world, including by Japanese naval attaches who took detailed notes on the shallow water torpedo modifications the fleet air arm had developed specifically for Taranto's harbor depth, lessons that would surface again, on a far larger scale, at Pearl Harbor 13 months later. The lesson both Taranto and the Bismarck strike delivered was identical, and it ran directly against everything a specification sheet suggested. An aircraft's value in combat was never fixed by its top speed, its modern silhouette, or how far behind the technological curve it appeared to sit at rest on a flight deck. It was defined entirely by what trained, disciplined crews, flying an exceptionally demanding attack profile in the worst conditions the enemy assumed would ground them, could actually deliver onto a target that never believed such an aircraft could reach it. The Swordfish's career did not end with Bismarck, and its record afterward reinforced rather than undercut the lesson of May 1941. Fitted increasingly to small escort carriers and, later, to merchant aircraft carriers converted from grain ships and oil tankers, unglamorous vessels barely larger than the Swordfish's own operating radius allowed for, the type became the backbone of Britain's mid-Atlantic anti-submarine effort. At exactly the moment the convoy were hung in the balance, flying off decks to short and too unstable for faster, heavier monoplanes to operate from safely. Swordfish squadrons sank or shared in the destruction of at least 20 German U-boats over the course of the war. Patient, unglamorous, relentless work that never produced a headline to match the Bismarck, but that did more than almost any other single weapon system to keep the Atlantic convoys running. The type's own courage was tested again, and this time found the limits of what bravery alone could achieve. During the Channel Dash of February 1942, when 6 Swordfish of 825 Squadron, led by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Asman, attacked the German battlecruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau and the cruiser Prinz Eugen as they made a daylight dash through the English Channel under heavy fighter cover. All 6 aircraft were shot down. Asmand was killed and posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, one of the war's starkest reminders that the same low, slow approach that had defeated Bismarck's fire control could just as easily be annihilated by modern fighters. When the weather, the cover, and the odds turned against it, the Swordfish was never invincible. It was, at its best, a weapon whose narrow, specific advantages had to be matched precisely to the right conditions, the right weather, the right enemy fire control, the right moment, by crews and commanders who understood exactly what those advantages were and were not. The aircraft remained in front-line production until 1944. With more than 2,391 built across the war, and stayed in operational Fleet Air Arm Service until 1945, longer in front-line use than the faster, more modern aircraft the Air Ministry had originally designed to replace it. By the war's end, It held the distinction of being the last biplane to see active combat service with any major navy in the world, still flying anti-submarine patrols and training sorties while jet aircraft were entering testing on the other side of the same conflict. The Air Ministry had been entirely correct, by every conventional measure, that the Swordfish was obsolete. They had been wrong about what that obsolescence actually meant in combat. Speed, range, and a modern silhouette were never what determined whether a torpedo bomber could sink a battleship. Slow enough to defeat a fire control system engineered for faster targets. Tough enough to survive a low-altitude torpedo run through a wall of flak that would have shredded a faster aircraft caught in the open a moment longer, and flown by crews specifically trained to execute that run in weather that grounded almost everything else in the sky that evening. The stringbag did what admirals on both sides of the war had considered, right up until it happened, essentially impossible. On the night of May 26, 1941, a biplane too slow for its own target's gunnery computers to solve became, for 20 critical minutes, the single most important weapon in the Royal Navy's entire arsenal, and it ended the career of the most powerful battleship afloat. Not despite being obsolete, but very nearly because of it.